You've reached the Signal Watch, movies, television, comics, and more. I'm your host, Ryan Steens. Join me and our cadre of co-contributors as we examine cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explore the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay tuned. We're gonna try to make this work. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Steens, and with me today is...
Amy Cavender.
And we just finished watching...
Midsommar.
That's right. So we are doing if you followed along, the Canon films. These are films that you saw that really made you think about the film or... think about film in a particular way, or it really resonated with you in a really personal way. So this is an interesting one to pick, I would say. So I just saw it for the first time about 20 minutes ago, and which Amy likes to come in and drop bombs on me and then go react. So I had not seen this when it came out. A confluence of events occurred between... Usually if I go to the theater to see a horror movie, it's with Simon, who'd already seen it, and said, "It's The Wicker Man. You don't need to see it." And I was like, that doesn't sound right, but okay. And I was traveling a lot, so I just took a pass, and I meant to watch it, and then it turned out COVID was very depressing, and so I was not seeking out a lot of horror during COVID. But we're on the backswing. Amy's in my house today, and we're I don't know if COVID's over, but we're dealing with it better. So you saw this in the theater, I'm assuming.
That is correct. Yes.
And take it away. What resonated about this movie with you?
So the reason why this resonated with me is because I felt a lot for the Danny character. And part of that is because in my life, when I was 18 years old, I had what can only be described as a really horrible summer. It started out good. I had graduated from the Texas Academy of Mathematics and Science up in Denton. I had a bunch of friends that were making the leap with me from Denton to Austin at the end of the summer, so we were going to reconvene there, and that was going to be great. I was really looking forward to it. And then about a month and a half later, when I was isolated and away from the people that I had been living with and supported by and supporting, my father died unexpectedly. And that was very hard, as one would expect. And then I, about a month after that, give or take, there was a huge explosion at a gas processing facility near my parents' home. And nothing really bad happened, but it was very unsettling and disturbing, and I was already very unsettled and disturbed still, so it just kind of compounded it a bit. And then about 3 weeks after that, a friend of mine was murdered, along with her niece, her nephew, and her mother, in an actually pretty famous murder case that a lot of people know about without realizing that they know about this case, because it's a very high-profile Innocence Project acquittal. Or I'm not really even sure what the term is, but long story short, one of the people that was convicted of this very terrible murder was found to not be part of it. And so every few months, something comes up about the Innocence Project, and I'm reminded of this thing again. And in fact, I actually sat across the highway from the site of the murder and watched their home burn, sitting on the back of my car with my best friend from high school. And we couldn't go across the street. There was nothing we could do to help. We just had to stand back and watch. So, I find Danny to be a very sympathetic figure. And when I went to college, like 2 weeks after my friend had been murdered, and maybe 2 months after my father had died, and with all the other stuff, I should not have gone to college. I should have stayed home. I actually begged my mom to let me take this semester off, and she was like, "No, you need to go. You need to, it's been a while. You need to get on with your life." And I'm like, "I'm not really ready to, but okay." And so the early part of this film, after the initial reveal, and I'm assuming it's okay to go into detail in the plot here.
Oh yeah, we're gonna spoil the hell out of it. So yeah,
spoilers ahoy. One of the things that I found very relatable about Danny was she would try to be normal and fail. And that's very relatable because, especially when you're going off to school, people are always asking, "Where are you from? What do your parents do?" Like, they're just trying to get you to know you. It's an innocent question. But there is no good answer when you were just recently standing ankle deep in your dad's blood. You just can't give a good answer. And then the people you're talking to feel bad, you feel bad for making other people feel bad, and it's hard for people to be around you. And so you have this choice of, like, do I self-isolate? Well, that doesn't feel right. Do I tell people my story and then they kind of just cringe away? Do you try to hide it? And there's not a good choice. So we saw that played out in several scenes in the first third of this movie, where she would try to be like, "Hey guys, how's it going?" And people would say, "Oh, I'm pretty good. I'm going to go see my family." Boom, run into the bathroom crying. And one of the ways that they handled this really beautifully in the film, to kind of illustrate the passage of time, is that in an early conversation between Pella and Danny, he says something about family, and her face just breaks, and she gets up and she runs to the bathroom, and then we see her crying in a different outfit in a different bathroom, and she's reemerging. And that's a really elegant way of saying that she's she does that often enough where,
right
that's a thing she does. She breaks, she hides, and she comes back out. And I thought that was really nicely illustrated in the film, and that's something that young people usually don't deal with profound grief, and it's hard to deal with when it's yours. And in some ways, we're even less skilled and less educated and less able to deal with it when it's someone else's.
Yeah.
So we don't have a good tool set for that in our culture. So I feel a lot for Danny. I've recognized a lot of myself in her. I also recognized a lot of the behavior of like, "Oh, I'm cool, I'm fine, everything's fine." Everything's not fine, girl. Things are not good, and you can't just make it good by saying that it's okay when it's very clearly not. So that's like the kind of first point of resonance for me. The second point of resonance, and this is from an entirely different era of my life, is because I was cheated on by someone that was very special to me. And, that's also another plot point in this film. There is a fickle boyfriend that goes from being kind of distant, kind of a jerk, to just straight up going outside the relationship, although in his defense, he was shoved out of the relationship and it was not fully consensual, but it did happen. And she sentences him to death. And that's, I wouldn't do it. That's not the choice I would necessarily make, although the choice she was forced with was, another situation when there are no good choices. But I think for people who have dealt with infidelity or dealt with a deal being broken, that wish, even if it's fleeting or temporary, or you can immediately, dispatch it with just, being mad and talking trash about them on a podcast, that flash, that moment, if you were in that moment and had a decision to make, would your anger dictate your action, or would your compassionate nature or your non-murderous nature at least dictate how you react? So I two horrible times in my life I feel great empathy for Danny's character, and they're both portrayed in this film. And in her life, it's all happening in a very compressed period of time. Is basically, we're looking at probably 2 or 3 months at the most. Well,
I think it was supposed to be deep winter, at the very beginning of the film. I thought it was about a full 6 months, because it was probably solstice to solstice was my guess.
That's a good guess too. So. But it hasn't been a whole year, that's for sure. It's all still very fresh. And she was apparently enrolled in school, but they cut her a break and she took off for a semester, which I wish I had done that. But yeah, it was a relatively compressed period of time. And meanwhile, my 2 points of identification took place across 2 decades. So it's a little different. Sure.
Yeah, the first third of this movie is, God, they could have made a movie just of the first third of the movie. I didn't have anyone have the kind of tragedy that you're talking about that you experienced, and I, while we were watching the film, I was like, oh, knowing your background, but I did recognize in the young men, she's dragging you down, man. Jamie has health issues, and it wasn't the negative thing of that, but it was never, everyone kind of knew where I stood, so they weren't telling me to break up with Jamie, but there was a lot of, is she gonna be okay? She's gonna be fine, let's go do, and I was like, no, including with my my immediate family before they got to know Jamie and understand, and that was the thing of, you mentioned people don't have tools to deal with the person, and that was incredibly familiar. And there were times then, as the years have gone by, where I've recognized in myself I did the wrong thing at that time when I was given that information. I did as 20-somethings do and retracted and didn't want to be involved, or was not as sympathetic or empathetic as I could have been at that time. And I do think there's a full movie there about that topic. How they extend that into the horror of the rest of the film. One of the things I didn't realize going into it was the movie was 2.5 hours. So
sorry.
No, it's totally fine. But it also this movie is incredibly well paced. I also am totally fond of movies like Solaris and Stalker, so that's kind of the pacing. I felt like I was on that same track and that same almost kind of vibrating with horror from the first act that carries through that's just got you on pins and needles for the full 180 minutes or whatever it ends up being. So I think it's really successful at what it's trying to do with all of that. But it does it doesn't take a fantastical turn. Again, we're not spoiling anything here. I didn't really know what to expect in some ways. In other ways, the part when they actually got to Sweden, when I watched the trailer, I was like, I think I know what this is. And indeed, it was that. I just couldn't predict exactly how everything would play out. I think the trailers maybe spoiled it too much. from some of the things they showed, of me being able to kind of connect the dots and knowing it's going to be a fairly thin story and this is going to be mostly about tone. But I do think it was incredibly well executed.
Yes. And one of the things that you may have noticed this in other movies that I've picked, I often am drawn to movies where people don't know what's happening. Mm-hmm. And people, including the people watching it necessarily. Like, there's a lot that gets explained while it's while you're in the midst of it, as opposed to you don't know what you're going into necessarily. Although with this movie, one of the things that was kind of interesting to me is that at least one person in their group did know some of the more troubling aspects of the cult, and that was the character that was played by the guy that I view as Chidi Anagonye, which is a real switcheroo, I gotta say. But that was a kind of interesting thing, because as the viewer, you have a pretty clear picture of what's happening, but because you're seeing things that are being done, in secret, or things that are, conversations that are happening between two people when they really involve a third and a fourth as well, but they're just not there. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that was also kind of interesting, is that most people in the film had a more complete picture of what was going on than the protagonists, I guess you could say, if you view Danny and Christian, who's her boyfriend, as the main characters outside of the Harga, then they have no idea what's going on. Christian has pretensions of wanting to know, but he doesn't really know, and Danny doesn't. I think it's very hard for things to penetrate your consciousness when you're really burdened with grief. And one of the things I thought that Florence Pugh did really well is her reactions were often very different than other people's. Like, for example, there's a part where two Harga elders jump off a cliff, and the first time she has the same reaction as the other outsiders, and she is horrified. They're all horrified in the same way, but she's horrified for less time. And then she kind of flatly looks up and sees the second person go off the cliff, and she doesn't react the same way, which is actually a pretty good representation of what trauma can do to people, especially repeated trauma in a relatively compact period of time, because she's in such a deep hole already that when she's brought down lower, she just can't see things the same way.
Yeah, I mean, the cinematography in this film, I remember getting discussed when it came out, and when you talk about it, I'm remembering some of the shots and how they framed that. There's a lot of dead on to the character and then reverse shot of their POV in this film, and it was exactly as you described. Of you kind of have the first time there's a certain kind of horror to it, and the second time it's almost a different flavor. I mean, I'm using the word horror in a different way here, but of that realization of we're now witnessing it kind of from her POV, and this is what she sees, and then kind of the reaction, as you said, of it being, kind of that emotively flat reaction, and they do that a couple of times with her, including when Christian's infidelity is revealed to her, and I thought that one was interesting. Partially because you don't see what she saw until after she's already reacted, and so you do have this like, oh my god, what did you know exactly what she saw, but you still are like, what did she see? And they do the exact POV shot.
And that was that leads into a discussion of kind of the flip side of the reaction to her trauma that she received when she was in her American higher education setting, right? Because she looked through this keyhole, saw whatever the mating ritual, I guess you could say, with full a cappella accompaniment.
Yes.
And then she was received into a group of women who got her into a comfortable place and then mimicked her grief. Which superficially looks like empathy. And if you are deeply traumatized and confused enough, that superficial resemblance would probably be very compelling. I would argue that it is incredibly poisonous and manipulative and performative, as opposed to an actual empathy where you are able to feel with another person and to try to, help them by understanding how they feel. And we saw this in a few other places as well, like, the previously with Christian, when he is having sex with that young Harga gal, the women that are watching them have sex are making sounds in unison with them, which was interesting. And that's, I gotta imagine that whatever drugs they gave him, there must have been some kind of like erection support, because that seems like it would be a very high anxiety, low performance situation for a guy.
I had that thought of, that's a lot of pressure on this gentleman in a situation he's just stepped into.
Correct. He has no cultural context. It's just like there's this lady on a bed of flowers and a bunch of other ladies, and but we saw kind of an attempt at empathy, or the performance of empathy there. And then also when the elders jumped off the cliff, I think our attention naturally gravitates towards the Americans and the British people and their reactions of like, oh my God, what the hell happened? Did she jump? Did she fall? Oh, he's jumping. This is terrible. Because they're speaking in language we understand, and they're expressing sentiments that we feel. But what the Harga are doing, especially when the man jumps and he does not successfully die, they start wailing in pain with him, which also happens at the end of the film. And that's a performance of empathy. It might feel good to do, or holy to do, sacred to do, but it's not compassionate. It's not really a positive behavior set, because you're not doing anything to truly help this person. You're not doing anything that really alleviates their suffering. You're just making noises like them.
Right. Which takes you to the last shot of the film. There's this speech that Pelle gives, and it's a seduction speech. And at the time, I was like, are they gonna really do the thing where the sexual wiles of Pelle are what draws her in? And that's not where they go with it at all. But it is as the seduction of asking, "Do you feel held?" Which, I mean, it's a cult movie. Cults exist out there, and you always wonder how people are vulnerable enough to feel, yes, David Koresh absolutely has his business going on. And that speech, and then that kind of final shot of her was, that's the second half of the journey for her in this film. And seeing her, if you don't remember, it ends with a shot of her smiling, going, "Oh, I am home. These people are all in empathy with each other," and she goes from wailing to kind of the acceptance of, "Oh, I'm part of something, of people who will support me through whatever brutality is occurring to me." And it's a lot.
It is. And I would, I think there's different interpretations of that smile. Because honestly, she doesn't say anything.
Right.
Like, the last sound we hear from her is a choking, gagging wail. You know, it's understandable. It looks like a smile of homecoming. But what home has she come to?
Oh yeah.
You know, like what? That's the question, I guess. Like, is it you know, Hargaland? Is she now Harga? Like, you know, what happens next to her? Does she stay there? Does she, you know, like, what happens to the May Queens? What happens to any of them? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I had a few guesses through the course of the film. There's this really maybe the closest to magic that occurs during the entire duration of the film, because you know they hint at magic through the but it's really hallucinations. It's these people are high to the gills throughout the entire length of the film. But when she's doing the maypole dance, she starts speaking in Swedish, just kind of automagically. And at that point, I took that as she is becoming one of them unconsciously, subconsciously, through kind of the acceptance and participation in the rites, and where Josh and Christian are you know trying to view it as anthropologists and all that, and Mark is viewing it as a sexcation. She doesn't have any reason to be there other than she's trying to flee something. And yeah, anyway, I don't know. Again, I don't think that there's any actual magic. I don't know how you explain that other than she's been there long enough to, you know, maybe pick up on some things. I don't think, if you think about that one particular scene too much, don't. Yeah. But yeah, it is. Yeah, we watched The Mist maybe a year and a half ago, something like that, for Halloween 2 years ago, and the horror of the film, you know, it's a movie about a bunch of monsters, trans-dimensional monsters storming around North America, but the real horror of it is, of course, what the people do when they turn on each other, and what happens when you're at your absolute last rope, and that was kind of the horror of it. That, like, I like a good, you know, Freddy movie or whatever, but I also think that there's, you know, sometimes there's a lack of substance to, you know, what is the story here? What am I supposed to understand about what's my takeaway here, other than, gee, it'd be really scary if a dude with knives could pop up in your dreams, versus the horror of, you know, what do we do to each other? And this movie does that in spades. It's going to sit with me a while, and not just the stuff that occurs, you know, in the back half of the film, because there's this weird idyllic part when they get there where everything's fun and cool and it feels like it's a big picnic vacation. And at the same time, you're like, oh, you're able to afford to just go to Sweden for 6 weeks to go screw off. Screw you guys. Whatever happens to you, you deserve. But, but yeah, the first third of the movie really kind of sets up. You know, there's just this recurring trauma that's occurring to Danny. That was very. I don't have the same experience, but nonetheless understandable, if not relatable.
Yeah. Yeah, and, you know, putting aside the character and the moral and ethical implications of that film, one of the things that I think stays with me, like, I have multiple tracks I think about it on. Gosh, it's a pretty film.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the vast preponderance of what you see is beautiful, and if you were to randomly take any frame from it, you'd be like, oh, that's so pretty, oh, that looks nice, oh, that looks neat, oh my god, what, you know. but the aesthetic was really powerful, and I think that's part of what heightens the experience of watching it, as in, you know, especially knowing that it's a horror film. It looks so different.
Oh, yeah.
From, what usually gets that label. Like, in the eeriness of almost everything happening in daylight.
I think there's one scene that occurs at night.
I think there's some darkness when what's his name? Josh goes into the temple.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, there is some darkness there, and that allows him to only have a few seconds of dawning horror to realize that someone's wearing his friend's face.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. Yeah. He doesn't get the full visual effect of that right away, like he would if it was Midnight Sun.
But that actually, to talk about kind of the technique of the film, and kind of how horror usually works. I didn't like horror growing up because I didn't like splatter stuff. It just made me nauseous and why would I do that, And this movie, somewhat like Annihilation, you get a lot of the after effect. Mm-hmm. You don't get the scene of Mark realizing what's about to happen to him. You don't get the scene of the knife entering his flesh. None of that is what's in there. It's the people's horror is realizing what has occurred. Yes. Over and over and over. So
yes, and that's kind of a relatable modern life experience in some ways, because lots of things happen out of our sight, and then we find out that they've happened, and that's when the actual nightmare begins. So, like having, I think that one of the things that is also really interesting is that the only direct violence that we see done that's like really nightmarish, besides the the scene in the temple when the mallet in the face and everything, is when the two Harga elders are and then of course one of the things that I also think was really interesting is that if they had done the final set piece a little differently with the sacrifices, you could be a lot more supportive of the Harga, right? Because part of the setup for this last scene is that there were two Harga that were sacrificed earlier in the film. Then there were 4 outsiders, and then there were 2 walking, talking, fully healthy young men that volunteered to be sacrificed. And they were given a taste of you, Y-E-W, to, ostensibly to help them not feel fear or pain. Mm-hmm. And it didn't look like it worked. And so that's deeply troubling, because these people clearly have a knowledge of plants and herbs and how to use them to various psychedelic and somatic effects. And you have to wonder, is it important for them to hear shrieking and howling?
Oh, right.
Coming from this.
Yeah. From
this sacrifice. Because the volunteers it sounded like they were kind of fed a line, which was like, don't be afraid, everything's cool, we're going to give you this, it's going to help. But they were suffering. Mm-hmm. And they were vocalizing that suffering. And then the crowd outside seemed to kind of fail in their performance of empathy in some ways, because it didn't, like, some of them seemed like they were grieving or expressing pain, but some of them seemed manic. Mm-hmm. Like it didn't read like pain or grief. It read like like almost mustache twirling reaction to these sounds of horror and terror and agony coming from that structure.
Sure. I mean, you don't have to go all the way to rural Sweden to get we have our own rituals within the U.S. of snake handling and whatnot, and whatever their faith or devotion or their various beliefs, but there's someone who's watching the people handle the snake, absolutely knowing there's the thrill of the risk of somebody handling that snake or doing whatever else they're doing. So yeah, that would, from what you're talking, yeah, I definitely had thought, the U didn't seem to have worked out,
right.
But didn't really process entirely through all the way to the reactions that are occurring outside.
Yeah. And I don't know, like maybe this was the one area of knowledge where they didn't have an adequate understanding, but it seemed like the suffering was the point.
So one of the things that I have noticed a lot in horror the past 15, 20 years, just culturally, has been we're doing a lot, and we always have been, but and kind of going back to like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or The Hills Have Eyes, but there's a lot more of, if you go out of the city, if you go out of the comfort of the suburbs, if you go out of the world I mean, this is the tale as old as time, with how horror works. But certainly, if you go to a rural location, you will die, which is an interesting take because it's also the inverse of the political conversation of the rural America tends to talk about the cities as this place where if you go to, you will die. If you go to the United States from Europe, everyone has guns and you will die. And it's we don't have isolation in the suburbs, even though plenty happens in the suburbs. Just look at your local crime tracker wherever you live. But it's interesting to me that, usually we think of Sweden as being, very nice blonde people wearing very cool glasses and sitting in IKEA furniture. Right. And being able to actually tap into the actual remoteness of parts of Sweden and that Americans really don't know that much. And once you start seeing, they were pagans not that long ago and they still wore those outfits, 80 years ago, something like that. I have pictures of my own grandmother who was from Finland and her, getup that did not look entirely different from what the people in this movie were wearing for their celebrations. So, it's just something that every time now when I see a trailer for a horror movie, I'm always like, oh, they went to a cabin in the woods and suddenly people are going after them. Yeah. And this is obviously very different, but it is taking this fragile person out of a place where you would say, well, why doesn't she go do this or why doesn't she go do that? She's accidentally been removed from all of that for an extended period.
Yeah, and the other thing that also I think is kind of interesting about the setting that they move themselves into, and it's probably a pretty uniquely American problem. Everybody speaks English, not everybody speaks Swedish. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of mileage that I think came from that fact. And then there's also the fact that there was a lot of they were incredibly adept at applying social pressure, mm-hmm. which was really interesting because it was always delivered with a smile. It was always delivered with we're just trying to be good hosts. Here, have your mushroom tea. Here, we're not going to tell you what's in this, but it's going to make you have a very effective boner, and you're going to also kind of hallucinate, feel a little nauseated, but you're totally going to have sex. It's very. They knew so much about so many different things that our point of view characters had no clue or grasp of, and it was just it kind of makes you want to study the language of wherever you're going. just so maybe you'll have a hint of like, oh, they're gonna make me have drugs now. or something. But it was kind of like, that felt like a uniquely American problem to have, of just like amble into places and be like, hey man, we're just here to, hang out, and we have no idea what's going on, but that's fine, right? It's not fine.
Well, and part of that is, also, had these characters been 5-10 years older, they would have been set in their ways. They picked people who are going to be open-minded university students who are investigating a scene. Ostensibly, they're going to go do mushrooms in Sweden for 6 weeks. But I think about when I would just travel for work, and everyone has their, I can't eat that, I'm on a special diet and all that. At that age, you're not doing any of that. Yeah. And so, you're definitely surviving all the time by going with the flow. And, I'm just trying to imagine that with like a bunch of retirees, and you're like, no, they would all be like, no, I don't want to eat that,
Yeah. Does this have gluten?
Yeah. But yeah, I'd be curious to read or hear from the screenwriter and the director as to kind of how they tapped into that and how they thought about those things, because like you said, they never outright say in the movie, this is what's happening, or this is the mustache swirling from our villains, but I think it's why people reacted to this film, of all ages. When I was talking to Jeff and Kiora, and they were like, have you seen Midsommar? You've got to see it. And I was like, well, I'm actually watching it this week. But they'd reacted also in their mid-40s to this, very recognizing immediately, who these characters are. They're very familiar sorts of characters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing about this movie. It's got a lot of points of relatability, mm-hmm. and last one standing is the one that switched sides.
Right. Yeah, comparing it to, like, say, The Wicker Man, since that was kind of one of the things I was told of, like, if you've seen Wicker Man, you've seen it. I mean, it is a movie that's about a bunch of people who, are trying to seduce people, and it ends with burning people inside of a structure. I mean, sure. But I think the having it be average people and not a cop on a case who's going to get thrown off the scent by Christopher Lee, all of which I love, but it's so overt in Wicker Man in some ways, like, Ingrid Pitt in the bathtub, as the guy comes bubbling in and things like that. It's just, it was highly effective.
Yes. Oh, and I think the big differentiator between this and The Wicker Man is the person that you care about the most, or that you have the most emotional import with, isn't the one that's burned.
Right.
And that's that makes it a radically different film. Yeah. In my opinion, because in this case you don't have someone reacting with horror to being burned, or to bees, as the case may be, depending on which one. It's the reaction that you're left with is, what is this person's state of mind now? Mm-hmm. And what's going to happen to her next? With someone that's burned, what's going to happen to them next. They're dead. But with her, we don't know. And that is, depending on how you want to look at it, beautiful or horrible.
Yeah. I don't really have anything else. So if you're cool with it, I think we've talked, I think, pretty well about this one. If you've not seen it, we've ruined it for you, and I'm sorry. But if you have seen it, we'd love to hear from you. Drop some comments onto the SoundCloud, or get on the blog and drop something in the comments there. And if we get any, I'll alert Amy, and we'll talk to y'all back and forth on the internets. But thank you so much for bringing this one and getting me to finally watch it at long last.
Well, I am glad that we did. It's been a delight, sort of, for what it is.
You can ponder further man's inhumanity to man. Yeah,
indeed.
All right, thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you.
That about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.